Hi there, Scott Spradlin, broadcasting live from the world headquarters for Wichita DBT, home of Wise Mind for the Distracted Mind, DBT for Adult ADHD, where I provide adherent comprehensive DBT alongside my fabulous spouse, Mariah, who's a clinical social worker and the co-director and co-facilitator of our DBT program, and my co-author. We're co-authoring together a workbook with New Harbinger Publications, due out later this year, 2025. DBT Skills Workbook for Adult ADHD. We're really looking forward to getting out there in the public and see what everybody thinks about it. We have tried to put together in our own practices with our clients' interventions the best we can call from how we understand DBT as it's been designed and following best practices, recommendations, so forth, but also looking at the literature that goes back to at least the year 2000 and other colleagues and professionals and researchers beginning to engage in feasibility and random controlled trials on applications of DBT for adult ADHD, which is not terribly surprising to myself as a DBT practitioner and also as an adult diagnosed with ADHD. It's something that's been on my mind for many, many years, and I have only, say, maybe in the last 10 years, really spent more time digging into the professional literature, the clinical research on the biology of ADHD, turning toward wonderful resources such as the great Russell Barkley, who's now retired from his profession, but who has dedicated his whole life to researching executive function impairments and what those look like, what they are, trying to measure them, so forth. Also, Thomas Brown is another influential uh, source on our work, as is our colleague Russell Ramsey, who's also been very generous in his encouragement in writing the foreword for the forthcoming workbook, as well as his general support in our work in adapting with DBT for ADHD. And so in this brief video here, I've kind of gone on a bit about myself and what we're doing in our practice, but some of the things that we want to tackle in the workbook are problems that you may face in your day-to-day life. And so we will be addressing some misconceptions of ADHD. First of all, it is a actual disorder. There was, as of this recording, recently there was an article that came out, I believe, in Forbes that looks at ADHD in kind of in a different lens, not as a disorder, but as the alternative explanation. I will not really critique that at the moment because I haven't really spent time with it. I think Russell Barkley has done a review of that article. You may want to look at his YouTube channel for more about that. But it is established as a disorder in the way that it causes significant impairments across global domains of functioning for human beings in terms of our executive function impairments show up in the way of underperforming educationally often in terms of work performance, relationships, social connections, vulnerabilities for substance abuse disorders and other behavioral compulsions, addictions, mood disorders, and so on. And the stakes get higher, of course, as we age out into adulthood. From childhood, we have somewhat of a canopy. The consequences are not as intense. Other folks are paying the bills and the rent and so on. And many of our mistakes and gaffes may be chalked up to youthful immaturity. But as those persist into adulthood, those become big problems in terms of interacting with peers who are expecting you to match them in their, uh, frankly, social maturity, also their behavioral skills and the self-directed activities that we're often expected to do in marriages, parenting, professions, and so forth. There's significant impairment there. And something we've learned from Russell Barkley and his research, and I believe he's done us a great service by advocating, I should say, maybe disseminating this information that ADHD correlates with significant shortening of life expectancy. So it makes it a big deal. And it certainly correlates very strongly with a number of social problems with employment and substance abuse and so on. And on a personal, embodied individual level, there are certainly lived experiences where ADHD adults are struggling and they often don't know what to do with their vulnerabilities and their executive function impairments in working memory, in their ability to initiate and persist in tasks, with their emotion regulation. If they don't know that they're contending with vulnerabilities and executive function impairments, then they're happy to oblige those around them in adopting the mantle as selfish, lazy, and immature as explanations for those problems. And maybe you're in that position if you're somebody who's contending with your own ADHD. Even as our clients learn about the underlying neurobiological developmental delays that account for these executive function impairments, uh, they struggle still with understanding that this model of the understanding the executive functions, the constellations of executive functions, how they develop over the course of life normatively, but also how they're delayed and impaired for those that are diagnosed with ADHD eventually, and how that interacts with the social environment. And so the DBT biosocial model is a pretty handy model that we can process and conceptualize the DBT or the ADHD adults' struggles within that model. On the one hand, the biology is the biological pathways through which these executive functions develop are delayed. And if they're not identified, if the external behaviors were not seen as indicators of executive function impairments, those individuals are going to deal with a social world where they're chronically hearing things such as, you're not living up to your potential, get your head out of the clouds. I don't know why you can't get your homework done, but you can spend all your time on this topic subject, or nowadays it might be in immersive video gaming, those sort of things, or you can really get lost in certain activities. So I don't know that you really have an intentional problem. It's a willfulness kind of thing. So it's kind of boiled down to character. And it's thought been proposed by Dr. William Dodson that ADHD adults, by the time they reach the age of majority, have likely heard thousands more corrective statements than have their neurotypical peers. And a lot of those statements, those corrective statements, may have been delivered with a kind tone, a matter of factness, and even then, coupling that with the other corrections or frustrations that may come out with more harshness, it's highly invalidating. There's an expectation that one will rise to the occasion, often without coaching, without skills coaching, without scaffolding, without techniques to externalize time, and to be able to elicit support from the environment in order to compensate for those impairments and be able to buoy up executive functions and maximize them under the conditions such as they are. So I think this is one reason DBT is a really fabulous model for adult ADHD, because we start with that biosocial model to understand what's happening, to give us a conceptualization, not as excuses for underperforming, but rather as a door into ownership, really owning your ADHD. Again, borrowing from Russell Barkley, who is emphatic that we ADHD adults own our ADHD and be responsible and take action to mitigate those impairments and vulnerabilities. And so we also think that DBT offers a beautiful panoply of structure and also skills which are elegantly designed to address those executive function impairments, which we'll get into in another video, and we'll talk about that. So just a few other pieces about ADHD. Again, first of all, it's real. It's not phony. It's not made up. It's also not something that simply emerges from trauma. And there's a lot of that talk out there also. I'm going to disagree with that, at least for now, unless there could be research or data to show us otherwise. We don't really have that at this time, but there are some very famous and popular folks out there, floating those ideas. Or that, for instance, another misconception of ADHD in my day would have been to watch too much TV. In fact, when I was being asked by certain important people in my lives at that time, please go get assessed. I did, in fact, remember saying to myself, well, I'll just stop watching television. That'll sort it out. And it didn't. Um, Other misconceptions are ADHD is overdiagnosed. That's debatable, and I think it depends on the um, diagnoses you're looking at, how diagnoses are achieved, and whether or not some of what we think is overdiagnosis may be an increase in awareness, increase access, and increase also to access to folks who are skilled in assessing executive function impairments as they would show up contextually and not just with sort of isolated tests and measurements uh, in, a, in a vacuum where there are not the cognitive demands to perform, with children in the room and a barking dog and deadlines for utilities and employers and so forth. So that's something we could get into some more detail maybe another time. I'm not prepared and didn't want to keep this one short. I'm not prepared also to talk about that at the moment, but I think it's worth talking about and to have an honest discussion about that. Another misconception that's out there, along with the overdiagnosis misconception, is that everybody has ADHD. And no, not everybody has ADHD. Not everybody has the neurobiological developmental delays or the constellation of executive function impairments that are required for a full diagnosis of ADHD or proper, whether it's a mixed combined type or inattentive or more in the hyperactive side of things. And there's also language there to be parsed in terms of what those words mean for all of us. We are in a culture that is increasingly under um, the weight of information surplus and lots of data and reactive communication amplified through social media and so forth. So there are a lot more happening in the world that's competing for our attention, and attention means dollars these days for advertisers. So we are all contending with that for sure. We could probably all do with some more mindfulness training and simplification and digital detoxing in our lives. But again, that's not the same as having these neurobiological impairments. We'll get into that later, but that's also, we're going to talk a little bit about that in the book. And when it comes to ADHD adults who have been diagnosed with substance use disorders and may be in a treatment facility, it seems scandalous to many substance use treatment providers that if a adult is diagnosed and properly meets diagnosis for ADHD, that stimulants are not necessarily ruled out because of problems with alcohol or cannabis or cigarettes or cocaine or caffeine and so forth. Rather, there's a strong body of literature that supports that folks who have substance use disorders and who meet criteria for ADHD, the stimulant treatment can actually assist them in their ongoing sobriety and recovery. Because the stimulant can be, and I'm not advocating that everybody should do that. I'm not putting this out there as a therapy advice video, but just as an informational video. But if it helps with the executive functions and dopamine production and reuptake and so on, it brings a better functioning to prefrontal cortex and other integrated parts of our executive function mechanisms that will help us, go from knowing to going, which is something we'll talk about also another video. How do we get going when we're progressing? But so again, there's a correlation there for folks that very good support that if they can be uh, permitted to undergo stimulant medication, that will actually improve their treatment outcomes. And I'm not saying this as a way to even, I'm not being imperial here. I'm not saying that, if you're a substance use provider, substance abuse treatment provider, that's what you should do. That's your call. That's your work. Okay. So, but look at the literature. Look at the literature. Obviously, if somebody's in an inpatient setting, you may not want controlled substances there. Certainly, that's understandable from, to prevent, contagion or risk of misuse by other members or or have it be treated like contraband. That's understandable. But in terms of its treatment, it should not just be ruled out because of a history of addiction. Should be considered. So those are a few misconceptions that we have to consider in the workbook and in maybe future videos and so forth. Thanks for watching this video. It's about 15 minutes, probably a good time for me to stop. I had intended this to be shorter, so if you watched all the way to the end, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll be back for more, and in the meantime, I will say to you, be mindful out there. I hope you're loved and well fed.